Hello and welcome to My Baseball History, presented by the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum and Baseball Library in Greenville, South Carolina. I'm your host, Dan Wallach, and I'm the Executive Director of the museum. My Baseball History is a long-form interview podcast where each episode I'll talk to someone new who has some sort of association to the game of baseball. No matter who I talk to, we'll talk about how they fell in love with baseball, how their career started, and how they got to be where they are today. On today's episode, I spoke with author, public speaker, researcher, and historian Phil S. Dixon. Phil is widely regarded as one of America's foremost experts on baseball history. For more than 30 years, he's appeared on numerous television and radio programs nationwide, speaking about the Negro Leagues and its players. He has interviewed more than 500 Negro Leagues players, family members, and those affiliated with its history. He lectures regularly to colleges, high schools, and community groups, and is routinely quoted in print and in broadcast media. Formerly in the Public Relations Department of the Kansas City Royals, he now serves on the National Advisory Board for the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City. He remains relentless in his pursuit of equality for African American athletes in baseball and in sports in general. Phil grew up playing and loving baseball and collecting baseball cards. By the age of 20, he had amassed more than 100,000 cards. But if you ask him what his most valuable card is, he'll tell you it's his library card. Phil has published a number of books, but he admits that he has failed as many times as he has succeeded. In fact, one of his first books, The Negro Baseball Leagues, A Photographic History, 1867 to 1955, was turned down over 100 times before it was published. When it finally was published, it went on to win the Macmillan Society for American Baseball Research Award for Excellence in Baseball Research and the Casey Award for the Best Baseball Book of 1992. Phil and I share something in common in that his love of history is something that he garnered from his mom. Phil's mom was a 1932 graduate of Western University in Kansas, and she always encouraged him to watch history as it unfolds, not just read about it in books. Phil has continued to give back to his community over the years. He's spent more than 30 years coaching baseball and volunteering for the Reviving Baseball and Inner Cities League. Major League Baseball's RBI program awarded him with the Josh Gibson Division Baseball Coach of the Year Award. In this episode, we cover lots of ground. Phil tells us what it was like to help start the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. We find out how Ted Williams paid for and furnished Phil's house. We learn why sometimes, to get the full story about a person, it pays to interview their wives and girlfriends, not just their coaches and teammates. And we hear the names and stories of more than a dozen old Negro League players and personalities, some of whom you probably know, but some of whom you may have never even heard of. With all that information and much, much more coming at you, it may be helpful to follow along with this episode's liner notes on our website. You'll still be able to enjoy the interview without the extra help, but sometimes when I'm listening to things like this, I like to really go in depth, so I've provided some photos and links to help give you all a better understanding of the things Phil and I are discussing. Those liner notes can be found at the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum website, which is online at www.shoelessjoejackson.org. If you want to follow along, head over to the museum's website and click on the podcast tab at the top. You can also just head to shoelessjoejackson.org/shoelesspodcast and it will take you right there, where you can click on the Phil S. Dixon episode or on any past episode you may want to catch up on. Everything in the liner notes goes in chronological order of how we talked about them in the interview, so you should be able to easily keep your place as you listen. At the end of the episode, I'll explain how you can answer a trivia question on Twitter to win a paperback copy of Phil's book on Buck O'Neil, so stick around until the end of the episode for that. The winner of last week's trivia contest was Chris, who you might know on Twitter as @TheSkimmers. After listening to the Greg Kreinler episode of My Baseball History, Chris knew about Greg's letter to Bobby Thompson, asking if he remembered a very specific detail about his shot heard around the world at the Polo Grounds. Thompson replied by saying, "I believe the lights were on," and signing his name at the bottom. So Chris, shoot me a DM on Twitter @ShoelessPodcast with your mailing address, and I'll send you your prizes. But back to this week's episode with Phil Dixon. We recorded this interview in the offices upstairs at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum just a few hours before the opening of the Black Baseball in Living Color exhibit. That exhibit featured the artwork of Greg Kreinler, who you can hear me talk to in a past episode of My Baseball History. If you've never been to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, put it at the very top of your list. First of all, Kansas City is awesome. Catch a game at Kauffman Stadium if you can, get some barbecue, and spend some time at the museum, and you've just had yourself a pretty perfect weekend. It's one of my favorite museums in the country and has some of the most powerful displays I've ever seen. In 2008, Geddy Lee from the band Rush donated his autographed baseball collection to the museum. It was made up of a single signed baseball by every Negro League player ever known to have signed a baseball. In some instances, they have the only ball known to exist. But there's so much more than that. Trust me, if you're a baseball fan or if you're a history fan, and I'm not sure why you'd be listening to this podcast if you weren't at least one of those, it's a trip you will truly enjoy. As you know, it was Memorial Day this past weekend, and we got a very appropriate listener question on Twitter asking for the story about why Shoeless Joe Jackson went to the shipyards in 1918, as opposed to going off to fight in World War I. I spoke with experts Mike Miller, Mike Nola, and Jacob Pomrenke this past week to get the answer, and I'll give you the full story at the end of this episode. But now, here's my interview with Negro Leagues author and historian Phil S. Dixon. You're originally from Kansas City. You've got family members who were in the Negro Leagues. At what age did you start to realize that the stories that you were hearing growing up had national and historical significance, and they weren't just your family talking about the past?
Well, it was probably around 1980. Prior to that, I would hear people talking about the Kansas City Monarchs. For instance, my stepdad had a cousin used to come down, and he would say he pitched for the Monarchs. And, of course, I've been doing research for 40 years, never found his name in a box score. But across the alley from me was a guy by the name of Eddie Dwight, and he played for the Monarchs. And I had people in my neighborhood, also professional boxers and things like that as well. So, matter of fact, 2 people in my family became professional boxers.
Right. Your brother and a cousin?
Yeah, that's right.
Yep.
You've been doing some good research there.
A little bit.
Yeah, that's right. So I was around sports. Actually, my first introduction to sports was the way that we learned to box in our own neighborhood. Mm-hmm. So we lived on a dead-end street. So up at my end of the neighborhood, they had teenagers, and I was their boy. Mm-hmm. And down the street, they had another kid who was in the same grade as me, mm-hmm. and he was their boy. So mm-hmm. we would do a bare-knuckles boxing, for the teenagers. So we were good friends, but, on that day we had to box each other and stuff like that.
Yeah, incredible.
But that's how people learn how to box in my neighborhood.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure that's not the only neighborhood that was like that.
Yeah, that's true. But it was a wonderful period to grow up. And like I say, you heard a lot of stories. My father, when I was born, was 49 years old, and my mother was 44. So they had come through the 30s and the 20s. And they would talk about people who mm-hmm. lived in the neighborhood and people who were involved in other activities other than what I was seeing them do mm-hmm. at that particular time. They're older people sometimes. And baseball was one of those.
Yeah. So there were originally 5 people who submitted the incorporation papers for the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in 1990. Buck O'Neil was famously a part of that group, but so were you. So take us back to 30 years ago. Why did you feel that having a museum dedicated to the Negro Leagues was an important cause to get behind? And then also, why did you choose Kansas City as the place to do it?
Well, originally, I came back to Kansas City. I was living in Colorado Springs, and I had been working out there. And I came back home in 1980. And when I came home, I had already picked up this appreciation for the Negro Leagues. Matter of fact, earlier that year, in 1980, I had met Carol Ray Marvell. Now, I've been a baseball fan all my life. I collected baseball cards, had a massive collection. So when I came back to Kansas City, I decided to look up some of these ball players. So I began to look them up, and at that particular time, nobody was paying any attention to the Negro Leagues.
Right.
And so it continued to grow for the next 10 years. I took Buck O'Neil to his first baseball card show. I would talk to people at the Major League Stadium, ball players, about other ball players, because I had a Major League press pass as mm-hmm. well.
Right.
Wrote for the Kansas City Call. So I had all this vast knowledge about baseball, and I would just share it with people. And then people would come along like Kevin Harlan. Mm-hmm. He was just coming into a radio. He was working for a local radio station. He hadn't blown up yet. He was just out of KU, mm-hmm. and he really enjoyed hearing what I was saying because he was learning a lot too. And actually, Kevin, when he graduated, a lot of people don't know this, he worked for KCMO Radio in Kansas City, mm-hmm. and he actually broadcast Satchel Paige's funeral over the radio.
Wow. It
was one of his first jobs on the radio. So they had this young 20-year-old guy broadcasting Satchel Paige's funeral.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah, I know. That's how I got to know Kevin. Mm-hmm. And so I would go on the radio with Kevin. He was doing a sports talk program, and the rest is history. Kevin blew up and done wonderful things since then. But he was a young kid starting off, and I was in my 20s. And these were the kind of people that I worked with and I met, and then we would get some of the old Kansas City Monarchs. There were quite a few still around at that time. Buck O'Neil, of course, most people knew him, but Jesse Williams was around. Lefty Lamarck was around. Doolittle Young, Maurice Doolittle Young. He played for the 1927 Kansas City Monarchs.
Wow.
And he was around, and so we could get some good people and get good stories, and that's what we did. Then 10 years rolls by, and Horace Peterson, he was running the Black Archives. He was the one who came up with the idea of actually making the museum here. It was Horace. So he called me over as a person who had a lot of knowledge, and he shared the idea of what he wanted to do, and that was the beginning. And it's a sad kind of story because that was in 1989 when Horace came up with this idea, and there was a city councilman named Charles Hasley who was kind of lame duck politician. He wasn't going to run again, so we needed to attach a good name to it. So we attached Cleaver. So this whole project became the Cleaver plan, but it was actually the Charles Hasley plan.
Interesting.
This is information that most people wouldn't know. And Horace Peterson, I think it was the weekend of my first book release, which was the Ultimate Kansas City Baseball Trivia Quiz book. He was supposed to come down and give a talk, and he didn't show up. And so I was going to give him a hard time that Monday, but that Sunday he drowned.
Oh, my God.
And he was the driving force behind these museums and the creator of the concept of bringing it here. He was the one who brought everyone to the table the very first time, but he never lived to see it all the way through. So that was Horace Peterson. And
what a shame, yeah.
I always like to remember Horace, and they won't be talking about Horace tonight when they talk about the 100th anniversary, but he played a role, like many unsung heroes.
That's what I was just about to say. A lot of the people who, have some sort of involvement with this museum or made this museum happen weren't around to see it happen. It's a shame that he's added to that list, but think of all the people whose portraits are down on those walls right now. They never got to see it either. Right.
And I've been blessed because I was there with the original incorporation, and I've been active with the museum one way or another. I've come to a lot of events, and that's even in between all the speaking I'm doing.
Right.
And I try to stay active with the museum and support them in all their endeavors.
Yeah.
And the only thing I might add to that is if you look at the original incorporation papers, there's 5 names on there. The top one is Buck O'Neil, who was the oldest person. Right under Buck O'Neil was the youngest person at that time, and that was myself. And where are we going on, 30 years now?
Yeah.
Okay. Think about that, man. Time goes by fast. And so, but I'm actually celebrating my 40th year is a serious Negro League researcher.
Yeah, that's incredible. One of my favorite things about the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum is the way that it's presented with the chronological timeline that shows what people of color were allowed to or not allowed to do in baseball, and then the oftentimes stark contrast of what they were allowed or not allowed to do in America at the same time. Was that always the plan for the museum, to not only be a baseball museum, but to also be a civil rights museum and an American history museum?
Well, if you do Negro League, you can't hardly not be those things, because all of those factors play into this story of the Negro League. So to be a good Negro League historian, you need to know some civil rights. You need to be a good student of civil rights. And I know for me personally, just to give you an example, 1980, I'm talking to people like Stokely Carmichael, actually in the 70s. I even marched with Ralph Abernathy once for a guy who we felt was falsely accused of first-degree murder. Wow. So I had that civil rights background, and it's all through the story.
Yeah.
Even if you look at the original attorney at the signing of the incorporation, actually at the meeting that they had at the YMCA, Elijah Scott was there. And Elijah Scott was also the person who started the case for Brown versus Board of Education, which later on went to the Supreme Court. Well, Elijah Scott in Topeka, who was also at that meeting in 1920. And he was there representing the Gilkerson Union Giants. Robert P. Gilkerson out of Spring Valley, Illinois, couldn't make it. So he had Elijah Scott come down and represent him at that meeting. So that's why Scott was there.
Wow. Today you share something in common with Lou Brock, Colin Powell, Danny Glover, and Ken Burns. And you're on the National Advisory Board for the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum.
I was trying to figure out what that was.
So what exactly does that mean? What do you do? I know you make appearances, and you are an author, so you go on all sorts of speaking tours. You were on a 200 city tour, right? What is your current involvement with the Negro Leagues Museum, and what do you see your role as moving forward?
Well, I'm kind of like an ambassador for the Negro Leagues Museum. So being an ambassador, I'm out in the public, and just telling the story and trying to bring more people into an understanding of what the Negro Leagues was all about and what it meant to your community. And I don't have the time to be on the regular board. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, because I'm not on the regular board, I'll put it this way. I used to work for the Kansas City Royals.
Right.
And I would go out and I would see things that were wrong with Major League Baseball. But the Kansas
Just a very short list, right?
Yeah, well, it was interesting. Hey, but the Kansas City Royals are paying my salary, mm-hmm. right? So someone would ask me a real question, mm-hmm. but I couldn't quite give them the answer that I'd like to give them. I had to give them a politically correct answer. Right. Being on the advisory board mm-hmm. and pretty much being a sole operator, I can pretty much say what I want to, and so you get a lot of truth.
That must be freeing.
Yeah, it's. I was free when I left the Royals, believe me, and so I've been free ever since.
Yeah, and you were with the Royals from 1987 to 1990.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah,
that's correct. I always joke and tell people that I got out of there just in time. Because they went down about 29 years of losing, so right. It was 28 after I left.
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, it was a good experience, yeah. And like I said, being in the clubhouse, I had access
right.
to people, and so as I'm doing research, I'll give you a good example. I was doing some research on the House of David, mm-hmm. and I'm looking at a box score from maybe the late 40s, and I'm looking at this box score, I'm looking at the names, and I see a name, Terwilliger. I said, Terwilliger, that's not too common a name. So right. I go get, back in those days, we had like a big baseball encyclopedia, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Weighed about 10 pounds mm-hmm. or whatever. So I go get my baseball encyclopedia, I looked up, and of course, I knew Wayne Terwilliger was a batting coach for the Minnesota Twins. So what I did was I waited till the Twins came to town. Mm-hmm. So I went up to Wayne and said, hey, Wayne, I was doing some research. My name's Phil Dixon. And I said, I happened to see Terwilliger playing for the House of David. I said, was that you? He said, oh, you got me. How did you figure that one out? And because I saw the box score, but I had access.
Exactly.
And so I could go right up to him. I remember Elrod Hendricks. He was with the Orioles, and I used to go to talk to him all the time. Frank Robinson was another one.
Absolutely.
I remember I wrote a story about Ruth Foster and Frank Robinson. I kind of compared them together. Robinson was managing the Orioles at that time. Mm-hmm. So when he came to town, I wanted his autograph, and mm-hmm. I had this magazine from Puerto Rico. Whoa. And so I go and I give him the story, and he said, oh, man, great story. And I say, hey, I know you don't really sign autographs, but I really would like to have your autograph. He said, I knew this was going to cost me something. So I had great stories. Oh, man, I used to have good talks with Sparky Anderson when he would come through. He's an older guy. And you could get information about ball players who played in the minors from some of these old guys. Mm-hmm. And it was just a great place to be. And, of course, I helped the Royals put together an old-timers game.
Right.
That was probably, I want to say 89 or 90, somewhere in there. Yeah. And so we had Ernie Banks here and Hank Aaron. And it was part of a celebration. And I had kind of organized it with another guy who worked at a cemetery. He wanted to put up a monument, his own money, at Satchel Paige's burial place. Mm-hmm. And so I worked with him, and the interesting thing was when he finished the monument, there was nothing on the back of it. So I said, hey, you mind if I write something for the back? He said, well, go ahead. I said, if you like it, you can use it. If you don't like it, you don't have to use mm-hmm. it. And the guy worked at the cemetery, and he was a monument maker.
Wow.
So he actually put the Satchel Paige monument together, and he liked what I wrote. And so today what I wrote is on the back of the Satchel Paige monument, and the guy's name was Gray. And once again, another player that many people have seen that monument. No one would remember him. Mm-hmm. And this wasn't African American either. And so, but these are some of the people that won't get any glory,
right?
But certainly had a role in all this history. So, yeah, it was a great time to be at the Royals.
Well, speaking of you doing some writing, when I was a little kid, I started learning about the Negro Leagues, specifically from the 1986 Larry Fritsch baseball card set that had 119 cards with black and white pictures on the front and then a short biography of the player on the back. And then the other way that I learned about the Negro Leagues was from the 1993 and 94 Ted Williams set that you did some writing for.
Right.
So, being from Chicago myself, I was blown away to learn the impact of Chicago on the Negro Leagues and vice versa. But a lot of the stuff that I've learned was from what you wrote, and it's crazy to sit here all these years later and be talking to you. How did you get involved with those projects, and what does it mean to you to be the person who tells people the story for the first time?
Yeah. Well, let me go to the Ted Williams set. And I might also say that in 1987, I had put my own card set together. It was called Dixon's Negro League Greats, and they were the first time that an African American had ever done a baseball card set, and mine were actually the first Negro League set that was actual photographs. And so the Ted Williams Company, they had experimented the year before, and they had put out some Negro League cards, and they wanted to take it to the next level. And so they had heard about my work, and so they contacted me, and they said, hey, we'd like for you to do 38 cards. And I said, okay, it sounds like a good project, right? So I didn't know what to charge them. Where do you go to find out how much you charge people to write the backs of baseball cards? Plus, I was going to provide the photographs and everything, right? So I don't know what to charge them. So it's the funny thing that happened is I came up with a price. They flew me out to Los Angeles. And so I'm out in Los Angeles. I got my price, and my deal was that you pay me so much up front, and when I finish, you give me the other part. So I pitched them my price, and they said, oh, let's do it now. Let's go to work. And so the first thing I said was, did I charge them too low? Did I charge enough? Right. Yeah, I gotta say they didn't even debate it. So anyway, but it was a hefty sum on top for me, I thought at the time. So anyway,
well, those are the best deals, right? The ones where you're happy and they're happy.
Yeah, everybody was happy. Yeah. Everything was delivered on time. And the interesting thing was, when I left there, they paid me the first part of that, that first half of that deposit. And I came back and I bought my wife new furniture for the whole house. And so she's happy. Yeah. And so when I delivered the cards, they gave me the second part of it. I come back and I put down on a home. And so
if you got all this new furniture, you need somewhere to put it.
That's right. And so that was my deposit. It came from the Ted Williams Card Company. So I always tell people, you better not say anything bad about Ted Williams, because Ted Williams helped me to get a home.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So, and what's interesting is I still live in that home today.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's worth more than I paid for it. So I guess I'm still making money off of Ted Williams baseball cards.
That's incredible.
Yeah, but it was a fun set, and it gave me some freedom. They said, put in there whoever you want to. So I wanted to get some diversity in there. So I did put Buck O'Neill in there. So I had a couple of players who were living. Josh Gibson was in there. Judd Wilson was in there. Webster McDonald. Vic Harris was another one that was in there. I also put Tony Stone in there. Ted Ratcliffe was another one. And so that freedom, Leon Day, how about that one? Yep. I put Leon Day in there. And so anyway, it became something that helped people to become more aware of the Negro Leagues, and for that, I'm just thankful that I participated.
Yeah, absolutely. I started doing my own reading on some of the players as a kid, and hearing stories about Cool Papa Bell being able to flip off the light switch in his room and be in bed before it got dark, or Ted Double Duty Radcliffe hitting a grand slam in Yankee Stadium during Game 1 of a doubleheader and then going out and pitching a shutout in Game 2 later that day. Josh Gibson hitting more than 800 career home runs, including 75 in one season. So those are the stories that I was like, I need to learn more about these players. This is obviously something that was special. It wasn't just they weren't good enough to play in the major leagues. No, these guys were good enough. They just weren't allowed to. Do you remember the first story that you heard about the Negro Leagues or Negro League players or a specific player where you were just like, all right, I got to learn as much about this stuff as I possibly can?
Oh, man. Probably it was the guy who really was the first Negro Leaguer that I talked to was Carol Ray Marvel. Marvel had played in the World Series in 1924. He was injured in 25, didn't play in the 25 World Series with the Kansas City Monarchs, who were playing Hilldale. But he played up until the 1930s, and then he had rotator cuff problems, and that was the end of his career in 1934. But as I began to talk to him, he started telling me about the California Winter League, and even when the World Series, I said, you guys had a World Series? I'd never heard of that before. He died in 1980. When he died, the lady who was kind of like his, she was a friend of the family, but she was also kind of taking care of him. Before he died, he said, give this guy these photographs. And one of the photographs he gave me was the panoramic World Series.
Oh, yeah.
And
I know exactly that photo, yeah.
Okay, and I came back to Kansas City. I'm in my early 20s, maybe 23.
Yeah.
And I'm wanting to do some research. No money. Something said...
Yeah, I heard you say you were 23.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no money, right?
Right, of course not.
Yeah, no money. I'm just working and stuff, you know. And so I came up with this idea to have copies made. So I went down and had 2,500 copies made at a printer right here. They were beautiful copies. And I started selling those for $3 a piece.
Wow.
And people loved that picture. Actually, I had two photographs. I had one of the 2014, and you'll probably find it around too. And that's how I raised money to do the research. And of course, that led to my first successful book, real successful book, which was the Negro Baseball Leagues of Photographic History.
Right.
But Mothel, and just hearing him talk about these things and then seeing pictures, and I didn't know who any of these ball players were. And I thought I was a pretty knowledgeable baseball guy.
Yeah.
And I had been reading, you know, like I had like some of the Fleers old-timer sets and stuff. So I knew about those guys, you know. But they were all white guys.
Right.
And nobody was talking about the Negro Leagues. And so, you know, I've been hearing these people in my community, but, you know, no one was talking in any detail.
Right.
And so that allowed me to get curious. And that's when I started researching. So I'm going to say he had so many stories. Cool Papa he was a great storyteller. And then some of the ball players who were excellent storytellers were the ones who amazed me the most. Chet Brewer was a really good storyteller. Jesse Williams was an excellent storyteller. Matter of fact, one I use in my presentations a lot of times now is Jesse Williams was saying that they were playing the Homestead Grays, and he went over to their bat rack. He's with the Monarchs. He went over to their bat rack, and he saw a bat that had nails in it. It was taped up and everything. And then he said to Josh, he said, "Josh, this must be your old bat." And Josh says, "I don't break bats, I wear them out." So, but he had stories. You know, you hear these guys just tell these stories, and then I would talk to people, and you know, I would find out who was dating who, and there would be old girlfriends around. There was one lady, I went to interview her. She was a bartender on Vine Street, and we were talking, and she started talking about Still Arm Tyler. She said, "I know a lady who used to date Still Arm." So, yeah, I said, you know, I'm kind of curious what happened to him. He was a great player, played for Chicago American Giants and Gilchrist Union Giants. He was a good player, came out of Texas. But at that time, I didn't know what had happened to him. And so she said, "I tell you what, I'm going to call her now." So she gets on the telephone, and I don't know, I never knew who I was talking to because she told the lady not to reveal who she was. So I'm talking to Still Arm Tyler's old girlfriend who's got another life now. And I never knew who it was. She had great information, and I wrote it all down, but I had no idea to this day who I was talking to. Julia Mae Jones was the lady who was the person who...
Your first source?
Yeah, she set up that call.
Yeah.
Now, she was the one that got mad at Jack Matchett, and she shot at him on Vine Street.
Right.
So that story's probably out there somewhere.
Yeah, I've read that story a little bit.
Well, I interviewed her, okay? I interviewed her, and you know, just all kinds of people. I remember when I was talking to Carol Ray Mothel, and he had no children, but he raised 3 children. And one of the children was, you know, she's probably about 60, 70 years old at that time. And she lived in Chicago. And then I would tell people I'm going to see her. Some of the older people say, "Yeah, she used to date Nat King Cole. Ask her some questions." So when I get up there, I'm asking music questions. I'm just asking questions. It was an interesting time. Lots of good people around. There was a guy also who worked for a local funeral home here, and he was the saxophone player in Jimmy Lunceford's band. So I could talk to him on a daily basis. And, of course, Jay McShann. I don't know if you heard this name before.
No.
Jay McShann was he left Kansas City with Charlie Parker and his band.
Okay.
But Jay was from Muskogee, Oklahoma. And so I heard he was from Muskogee. So I said, Newt Joseph, the Monarchs' third baseman, was from Muskogee. Maybe he could tell me something. So I go over and I talk to Jay and I tell him I want to know something about Newt Joseph. And he said that when I left Muskogee and I was coming to Kansas City, my mom said, you be sure to look up Newt Joseph. He'll take care of you.
Wow.
And so there's this great web of connections. It was just a fascinating time. It was different than these times. These times have their own unique kinds of things. A lot, I can talk to you about names that 30 years ago, a guy sitting in that same chair wouldn't have knew any of these names. So,
I think that's what's so important about the work that you've done. You won the 1992 Casey Award for the best baseball book of the year with Negro Baseball Leagues: A Photographic History. Mm-hmm. That book was turned down 100 times before you were able to find a publisher. Right. What made you believe that book was so worth pursuing? Well,
I think I was ahead of everyone else's thinking. Kind of give you an idea. One time I went to a baseball card show, and I had an autograph ball of the 1946 Monarchs. And so I went to a guy, everybody's collecting Major League stuff, I go to the guy, I say, hey, I got this ball here. I wasn't planning on selling it, though. I just want to see what he said. Mm-hmm. And he said, that's not worth anything. Because they knew nothing about it.
Right.
Now, if I had a 46 ball, now that same ball, I hate to tell you what it'd be worth, right? But it was a signed team ball with everybody. And the interest just wasn't there.
Right.
And at that particular time, you're going to say 99% of the collectors are going to be white guys.
Of course.
And they're going to be white guys, maybe 30, 40 plus.
Yeah.
So you go back 30 years, these are the people who grew up with Mickey Mantle and Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams. Those were their heroes. Mm-hmm. And they never thought about the Negro Leagues. And that's one of the reasons why, like, a Hank Aaron rookie for so many years was way behind, and probably still is, but it's kind of inched up a little bit, the value of a Mickey Mantle rookie.
Right.
It just wasn't the awareness. So when I'm trying to pitch the book, nobody believes in it. Mm-hmm. Nobody believes in it. They didn't think they could sell it. So I had to find somebody that believed they could sell it.
Yeah.
So that was the story. So a lot of rejections, and a lot of rejections from major people who later actually put out books inferior to mine. Okay, so that's a different story.
Well, this was before the internet, so before we had so many of these stories documented and preserved that we do now, how did you get started with your research to compile a book like that? You mentioned the photo that you received, but how did you track down former players and where they lived and stuff like that? Was it just, all right, I'm going to talk to one guy and hope that he gives me two names, and then I'm going to go talk to those two and hope they give me two more names? Like, was it just a ton of legwork, or was there a place where you could go to read about things?
No place you could go to. I'm making this happen.
Right.
So I did have what you just said, example, if you go one guy and he can tell you about someone else. But I had more people who you would go to them and they would say, yeah, so-and-so, he's from Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. Last time I heard, that's where he was living. So I would travel. So say, for instance, I'm going to, say, to New Orleans, but I might go through Memphis, right?
Right.
And so I knew that, maybe there's some ball players there. And so, especially if they had like a name that was like Verdell Mathis or something like that. And I don't know where Verdell is, but if I can get one person in that town, I can get the rest. Right. So what I would do was I would go through town, I would go to the telephone booth, and I would tear out the page that had Mathis on it. And back then, the telephone book, the white pages, it had actually the address too, and the name. And so then I would come back to Kansas City, and then I would get the zip codes. Now, none of this, you had to go back to the library to get the zip codes.
What an archaic time you lived through.
Yeah. So what I would do is I would write a form letter to all these people asking them, do you know this guy? I'm looking for this guy, and I would have this story. And then people were, I put a self-addressed envelope in
And would
there.
you say that you were doing research? Would you say that you just wanted to talk? How
how
did you get people to open up to you?
Because I would say I'm doing research.
Okay.
I would say I'm doing research for a book related to the Negro Baseball Leagues.
Cool.
And then, because remember, I just tore the page out.
Right.
So I might get a letter back, and a white guy saying, I don't know any black people, because I don't know who I'm writing, but I'm just taking a shot in the dark.
Yep.
Another one I used to do, I was a member of the AME Church, still am, African Methodist Episcopal Church. And so I knew that I could go into any community and find the largest, AME Church, we'll put it that way. Yeah. And then what I would do is find the oldest person in the church with the sharpest mind. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I would call on the telephone, just ask for the preacher, and then I would ask, who's the oldest person with the sharpest mind? A guy. And I knew this because if you were in a community, and most of these black communities were kind of independent, away from the city, they were segregated.
Right.
That's the best word.
Yeah.
And so if you were doing something in that segregated community, people knew you. Mm-hmm. So if I could get that one guy, not only could tell me if you were there, he could tell me if you were deceased, maybe when you were deceased, maybe he could tell me a relative that happened. Mm-hmm. I went to Lexington, Missouri. I would go to the barber, Floyd and Buzz Baldridge. They knew everybody because they cut all the black people's hair. And Floyd was like 90 years old. Can you imagine what information I got from Floyd?
Yeah.
And once again, they'll be talking about the Negro Leagues this week, but they won't be talking about Floyd Baldridge. Yeah.
So you have interviewed hundreds of people. Was there somebody that you never had the chance to interview, whether it was because you just didn't quite get them before they passed away, or they passed away in 1925, and you're just like, man, I wish I could have had a chance?
I missed Dave Malasher. He would have been great to talk to. And I missed Webster McDonald. And they died right around the time I'm starting. Mm-hmm. So I missed those two guys. And those are two people that I really would have liked to talk to.
What kind of stories do you think you would have been able to get from them, or what information that you haven't been able to get from other people?
Well, I've listened to Malasher on tapes, and he was very knowledgeable, not only about baseball, but all kinds of things. He was a poet, and I even do poetry. So I probably could have had a great talk with him. Yeah. And then Webster McDonald, the interesting thing about him, he came from the Negro Leagues, played for the Chicago American Giants, and then he ends up in Little Falls, Minnesota. And so I was always interested in town ball and people playing outside of the major leagues, which one thing I might mention, and you have to really be a student of my work to catch some of these things, but if you look at Only the Ball is White and things written prior to me writing, what they did was they pretty much focused on baseball in the major cities. So, or like they would look at Chicago, New York, or if they're looking at Baltimore or Newark, or or Kansas City, St. Louis.
Right.
So when I came along, my emphasis was I'm looking at town ball. Mm-hmm. So Webster McDonald playing in Little Falls, Minnesota, really interests me a lot, and so that's one thing that I presented to the hobby, to the story. And so now you see lots of people writing books about baseball in their town.
In their specific
You're
town.
Right. That had not happened yet.
Yeah.
And so that was one of the things I did. And also, if you go back and you look at, you can use Only the Ball is White, because a lot of people were introduced to the history, but for me, it wasn't that way. Mm-hmm. Mine was more of a community kind. And I had played baseball on all black teams. And one thing I knew for sure is that one or two ball players are not the team. They may be the star players of the team, but you can't play a game without all the rest of these people. And if you've got a championship team, you can't win a championship with two guys. So you got to have some other good players surrounding you. Mm-hmm. So when I did my book, what I did was I focused on all of those other people. And so, you talked about Kansas City. They talked about Satchel Paige. Mm-hmm. They never talked about Buck O'Neil.
Right.
See, so Buck O'Neil is, I'll put it like this. He always said to me, you're the one that made all of this happen. And it's not because I wrote the first book, it's the way I approached it.
Absolutely, yeah. One of the things that makes the Negro League so compelling, and the thing that the detractors use most often to undercut the true greatness of those players, is that it's hard to find accurate statistics or historical records of the players and of the games that took place. Is that the hardest thing for you when you're doing your research for a new book? Being able to quantify how great these players were, or being able to find written records of what happened and where?
Well, if a person follows my work, you'll find out that I'm not the person who say, oh, this guy was a 375 hitter. You'll never hear me say that. You'll never hear me say that. Now, I can say he batted .375 in the 1924 World Series because I have all the games. Mm-hmm. But you'll never find all the games. And so when you hear someone say, this guy was a lifetime whatever, to me, it's a lie.
Right. At best, it's a guess.
It's a guess, and a lot of times it's a horrible guess. And I'll tell you the reason why. If you take certain cities, like for instance Chicago, mm-hmm. I was doing some work, and this was just this past week. Somebody was telling me that a home run Johnson batted such and such in 1910, mm-hmm. right? Well, first of all, having done real research on this team, I have all the box scores. All right, been gathering them for years, right? Gone through all the Chicago newspapers, picked up box scores when they went outside of Chicago. Chicago didn't have at-bats. Many of the box scores are missing. They would play what they call a Sunday morning doubleheader, so mm-hmm. they play at 10 or 11 instead of going to church, and then they play another one at 1 o'clock. Mm-hmm. And they have a big audience of both games because a lot of people didn't go to church. Mm-hmm. So a lot of those first games are missing.
Yeah.
And so you got all kinds of missing games, but yet you're telling people he's a lifetime so-and-so batter. And I know it's wrong. The other thing, I'll tell you something else, too. A lot of these totals are too small.
Of course. Okay? If there's missing information, you can't have the true totals.
Yeah, and here's one thing I learned from Major League Baseball. I used to keep statistics when I was with the Royals, mm-hmm. right? So I'm the one who's sitting at the computer pushing things in from opening day. Mm-hmm. So we come out of the first month, you got a guy, he's got 100 at-bats. He's batting .350. He's going to end up at the end of the year .238. He's not going to end up .350.
Right,
maybe George Brett or somebody might end up there. But
you take a small sample size.
Right.
Guys,
yeah. And sometimes I think that these guys don't understand that this is when you become like a true baseball person. Yeah. You have to look at everything.
Right.
And sometimes I think that they don't understand that. So I always tell people, when you hear somebody saying that so-and-so lifetime batter, I say ignore them.
Right.
Because that's not the credible history. Now, here's a good example of what you can do. I wrote a book on the 1931 Homestead Grays. Mm-hmm. Couldn't find at-bats for a lot of the games, no problem. But what I was able to do is this. I can tell you how many home runs he hit. Mm-hmm. I can tell you how many.
Those were in the newspapers.
Right. I can tell you triples.
Right.
Now, guess what? I might miss some because there's no box score, right? But I can give you a list of all the triples, all the home runs, and I might be able to tell you who hit the home runs off of, mm-hmm. both in exhibition games as well as league games, which is another debate. I happen to be a person, if I want to see a complete picture of a ball player, I want to know what he did in every game I can find.
Right.
But you have people now who are doing research, and what they're doing is they're only taking the games against other black teams, mm-hmm. all right? But no team could survive playing only black teams.
Right.
And so if you throw out the other part, then now you don't really get a true picture because the numbers are too small. And you can say, well, those other guys are semi-professional baseball players. But if you do a lot of research, when I was doing my 200-city tour, I would actually have box scores of guys who, like maybe they're playing in Manhattan, Kansas, right? Mm-hmm. And so I would have like the box score of the team that played against them, right? I had a way the way I would show it so people could see it, and they would see the names. Oh, hey, I know that family used to live here for years or something like that, no matter what town I'm in.
Right.
But what I started to notice was, so wait a minute, that guy was in about 4 other towns who was pitching for them. That guy playing shortstop, he was over in the other town. Mm-hmm. And so what they were doing is some of these towns, they were bringing an all-star team together. But you had to sit with this for a long time to see.
Before you start seeing the names over and over.
Right. And so.
Well, Satchel Paige claimed to have pitched for over 250 teams. And some people are like, there's no way. But there is. When you pitch for 50 years, and sometimes you might only pitch for somebody for one game if they offer you, hey, Satchel, I'll give you $100 if you come pitch for us on Sunday.
Yeah, the Monarchs used to lease him out.
Right.
They used to lease him out. So he'd go in. I went on a 200-city tour here, and it was 17 states. Mm-hmm. And I would say out of those 200 cities, probably 195 of them Satchel pitched in. Mm-hmm. So I could always find a Satchel Paige story, and they would be amazed. Or I would get there, and they say, my dad played against Satchel Paige and so. So I didn't find that. He said, yeah. I said, do you have any information on that? I was gathering information,
right.
But Satchel Paige was everywhere, everywhere. And
do you think that's why he's one of the names that endures so prevalently, where everybody knows who Satchel Paige is?
Yeah, I think it has a little bit to do with it. Yeah, most definitely. Because he pitched for so long, and he pitched all over the place.
All over the place.
Yeah. From coast to coast.
Yeah.
I remember it was a game that they were playing in. Satchel had been pitching a bunch, so he didn't want to pitch that night, and people were demanding that he come out and pitch. This happened in St. Joseph, Missouri, too. People were demanding that he come out and pitch, and he was just tired, and they felt like they didn't get their money's worth. And so I remember the Mississippi newspaper saying, well, we'll never invite the Monarchs back because Satchel Paige didn't pitch. So he not only did he want to pitch a lot, he had to pitch a lot.
He was expected to.
Yeah, it just, I don't think there'll ever be another Satchel Paige, and there never was a Satchel Paige before Satchel Paige.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier about how black baseball teams couldn't only play black baseball teams. They had to play some of against white all-star teams. Your newest book that recently came out about Dizzy and Daffy Dean's Barnstorming Tour of 1934, what made that topic one that you wanted to devote your time to, and what is your favorite thing that you learned while you were researching it?
Oh, man. I learned a lot. Some of the strategies used by newspapers to not give the black player credit. So is Dizzy Dean at that particular time, 1934, he's the biggest name pitcher in baseball. If you listen to Eldon Auger, Dizzy beat him in the final game of the World Series. He would always say that, say he's faster, and he would name a few other people as faster. But when it came to getting the job done, the Dean boys in 1934, 35, they were pretty good.
Didn't they won like 49 games combined one year, right?
Yeah, that was 34.
Yeah,
that was 34.
30 and 19, right?
Yeah. And now what's interesting about the 30? I grew up as a baseball fan, and I always heard that Dizzy Dean was the last National League pitcher to win 30 games. But being a student of baseball, I remember a baseball digest back in the 70s or 60s, it was like or late 60s maybe, that was debating that. And so I had a chance to revisit it when I wrote this book. And so I don't think Dizzy won 30, not by today's rules. As a matter of fact, those two games that were in debate, they went to the commissioner's office. But this is before he was on track to win 30. How about that?
Interesting.
Yeah, he was like, I don't even know if he was at 20. He might have been 19 or 20, something like that. So they were still up for debate.
Wow.
In the end, he gets 30, and people quit talking about it. And so anyway, Dizzy, I think the newspaper coverage and who was writing the stories, I thought was real interesting. And the thing that was so fun to write about the Dizzy Dean book was, if you're interested in race relations, you're interested in media, you're interested in civil rights, you're interested in baseball history, you're interested in comparing ball players and just great teams playing. The Monarchs were great that year. The Pittsburgh Crawfords were great that year. Dizzy Dean was great that year. Everything that I wanted was in that 2-week span after the World Series. It was like the perfect storm. And so, man, I had so much fun writing that book.
Yeah.
And it's been well received.
Yeah.
It's been well received. And, I'm pretty excited about that. I always go out and I always check Amazon for sales ratings. And the Dizzy Dean book has been going real good. Then someone told me to check my Ruth Foster book today. Since we're coming up on this 100th anniversary and Ruth Foster being the first league president, my Ruth Foster book jumped past my Dizzy Dean book. I said, I would never expect that, but Ruth Foster's been in the news every day, so all of a sudden people want to know who's Ruth Foster.
Yeah, well, we'll get to Rube in a second, but 1934 wasn't the only time that Dizzy Dean played against black players. With America's entrance into World War II, Satchel Paige actually committed himself to pitching in frequent exhibitions to sell war bonds and raise money for war-related charities. And he convinced Dizzy Dean to come out of retirement, forming an all-star team consisting of recently drafted white major leaguers and minor league players. On May 24th, 1942, Satchel and the Kansas City Monarchs defeated Dizzy Dean's All-Stars 3-1 in front of almost 30,000 people. The game was played to raise money for the Navy Relief Fund, but more importantly, it was the first time a black team had ever played at Wrigley Field in Chicago.
That's right.
Why do you think it was important to Dizzy Dean that he play against black players?
Well, Dizzy Dean had been playing against black players all along, and he had great friends amongst these players. I know Frank Duncan, Dizzy used to warm up with Frank Duncan. And Frank Duncan had one of those little tight mitts. And in the Negro Leagues, they were the ones who came out with these tight mitts that popped. When that's now it's commonplace in the big leagues, but in the Negro Leagues, that was part of the show.
Right.
And Frank Duncan had that kind of mitt that popped like that, and Dizzy Dean would warm up with him. He was just so impressed by that, where that mitt popped. And I remember
it makes you sound faster.
It does. It does.
That 88-mile-an-hour fastball is now 94.
It sounded like a gun went off or something. And Dizzy said, "I wish I could take you to the big leagues with me." And Frank said, "I wish I could go."
Right, I bet.
And then, of course, he said some things about Satchel Paige, the one that after seeing Satchel Paige, they asked Dizzy, "Who's the greatest pitcher you ever saw?" thinking he was going to brag on himself. And he said, "The greatest pitcher I ever saw was a colored boy named Satchel Paige." He said, "If you could get him and me on the same team, we could win the pennant by the 4th of July and go fishing to the World Series stars." Yeah.
I love that quote.
Yeah. So, he was complimentary to black ball players all along. The other thing is, in 34, when he came out in Barnstorm, he had Barnstorm the year before, but it was only 3 games.
Interesting.
And his brother was supposed to come with him, but his brother was with Columbus, and they were in the Little World Series, so he couldn't come. So Pepper Martin came with him. They played in 3 cities. They played in Kansas City, Missouri. Then they went to Concordia, Kansas, and they played the last game in Oxford, Nebraska. And that day, Dizzy got knocked out when he got hit in the head. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. So it wasn't the first time in the 34 World Series like I learned. It actually happened in Oxford, Nebraska. That's in the book.
Wow. As far back as 1918, Babe Ruth played against all-black teams, and Shoeless Joe Jackson and some of the other banned Chicago White Sox players barnstormed in the 1920s after their banishment to continue making money playing baseball, and some of those games were against black players and black teams. Bob Feller and Satchel Paige organized an interracial barnstorming tour in 1946, the year before the color line was broken in Major League Baseball. But the majority of owners and managers thwarted efforts like this. The baseball establishment also pretty much frowned on interracial barnstorming, and white players were eventually banned from wearing their Major League uniforms during these games. Larry Tye, who is a former reporter at the Boston Globe and the author of another Casey Award-winning biography, which is called Satchel, The Life and Times of an American Legend, he said that while the color barrier being broken by Jackie Robinson was undeniably a great thing for baseball and for America and the world, it also ultimately led to the demise of the Negro Leagues and much of the barnstorming that defined that era. His quote is, "Why pay to see black players in pickup games on makeshift fields when you could see them at Ebbets Field Municipal Stadium or on television?" For years, the Negro Leagues thrived with black team owners, black team presidents, black managers. Why, 70 years later, does Major League Baseball have so few people of color in front offices and leading teams?
Well, one thing I can say about the Negro Leagues, when the Negro Leaguers actually disappeared, it was the end of town ball as well. Town ball would never thrive like it had, and part of that was after the war. Before the war, America's a different place. Many people never left their communities, and small towns are thriving, that kind of thing. After the war, things changed quite a bit. Not only do you have integration of black ball players, but once those Negro Leaguers are gone, town ball is gone. Once town ball is gone, now you're not getting the development of the fan outside of the major league team.
Interesting.
So it's not feeding people the knowledge. So as those people died off, there's nothing to keep them interested. So I think that the Negro Leagues played a role in baseball right up to this day.
Absolutely.
And typically people wouldn't think that, but in town baseball, if you want to go back to the 20s when Ruth and those guys could barnstorm after the season, or a lot of players coming from small towns, if you beat the Kansas City Monarchs, well, J.L. Wilkerson, Tom Baird, they come back to Kansas City and say, hey, we saw a pretty good pitcher over in Nebraska, about around Omaha. I think he was in Council Bluffs. And, hey, you know what? And the scout said, oh, yeah? What did he do? He said, hey, he beat us 2-1. He said, okay, we want to go up and take a look at him.
Right.
So it actually helped white ball players, too.
Right.
If you could beat the Kansas City Monarchs or you beat the Homestead Grays, you had to be pretty good.
But so that's the crazy thing to me, and we can bring it back to Rube Foster here, is the Negro Leagues were undeniably successful. they had teams that had fans all over America, and people would travel to go watch the Kansas City Monarchs when they came to town. And you had guys like Rube Foster who were entrepreneurs. It was more than just, he's a manager of a baseball team. Oh, yeah. No, he was a businessman.
That's absolutely correct.
And it wasn't just Rube Foster. There were black owners for almost all these teams, So why did Major League Baseball not understand that they bring something to the table? Whether we put them in control of a team or not, we can still have them in the front office and use their ideas and learn from what they've learned, because they know how to market. You've got to make money. So why did Major League Baseball not take advantage of that?
Well, I'm going to guess now that they felt like they did not need them.
Mm-hmm.
Major League Baseball felt like they had their operation down pat.
Mm-hmm.
So why change something that's working for
Yeah.
you? And so they did hire a few players as scouts, because that cut out the middleman. So you don't have to buy from the Negro League team. Now you can go out and get somebody, and now you compete. Now you got a young kid say, look, I can bring you to the Kansas City Monarchs or the Homestead Grays, or we can bring you up here to Pawtucket, so you know what I mean, right?
Right.
So, and you'll be right in our organization, and you got a chance for the big leagues, but they also would do this. I know this happened with Kansas City quite a bit, because they ended up sending so many people to the major leagues.
Mm-hmm.
White owners would actually say, hey, I saw we had a tryout, and they had to have camps, and black kids would show up, and they say, this guy's pretty good, but he needs some seasoning.
Mm-hmm.
He'll be a good ball player. So they would call Tom Baird, say, hey, look, I got a guy down here who showed up, at the Yankees tryout camp. He's a pretty good ball player. We can't use him right now, but maybe you guys can use him.
Mm-hmm.
And so the guy would end up in Kansas City.
Yeah.
But the funny thing was, he would end up in Kansas City, but he might not ever play a game in Kansas City.
Mm-hmm.
A good example of that is Lou Johnson. Played with the Dodgers. He played with the 1955 Kansas City Monarchs. Never played in Kansas City. Matter of fact, they only played 3 games here that year.
Mm-hmm.
So the rest of the time is out there on the road.
Right.
So they're a real barnstorming team.
Right.
And that's another thing. And I think, sometimes people kind of stretch the story, and I've probably been telling it so long that I see it differently, is that, you'll hear about the Kansas City Monarchs, and they talk about all that they were to this community. But in some years, like the year I'm talking about in my Dizzy Dean book there, the Monarchs played 3 games here.
Mm-hmm.
You don't mean much to a community when you play 3 games. And so...
Not directly, but
that's exactly
it
right.
was a source of pride. Kids from this neighborhood and this area grew up thinking, man, if I act right and I try hard and I do well in school and in sports, I can grow up to be a Monarch.
That's right.
And people in, Lincoln, Nebraska didn't have a team to look up to like that.
Right. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, from an economic standpoint.
Of course.
From an economic standpoint.
You're not bringing jobs to the community when you're only in town 3 days.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
But when you hear people tell the story, they talk about, it being one of the 3rd largest businesses. And, actually, the Monarchs might play more games in Omaha or Lincoln, Nebraska, or some city like that.
Yeah.
Belleville, Illinois had a lot of them. There's some pretty good, interesting.
Belleville's just outside of St. Louis.
Yeah, right. Yeah. The Monarchs from 1930 to 1938 never played in St. Louis. The St. Louis didn't have the capital, but right across the river in Belleville, they had a team there.
Interesting.
The Stags Brewery team, and they had a beautiful park. They had a couple of guys used to be in the major leagues, and that's where the competition and the money was.
Bingo.
So they jumped right over St. Louis. And then when they finally got to St. Louis in 1938, there were some pretty good ball players in St. Louis, but they just weren't. It just wasn't producing the revenue like that town was. And so the Monarchs get there in 1938, and they get beat by a guy, a pretty good pitcher.
Yeah.
Later on, he played for the Brooklyn Brown Dodgers.
Interesting.
Yeah, so and there's other good town. Orange, New Jersey. Orange, New Jersey was a big one. Patterson, New Jersey in the 30s was another good baseball town. And Kansas City, Kansas, where I grew up, was another good town. They had the Snyder's Jewelry team there. And what it is, it would be a white team. And they would have a good park that they built. They got a good, solid audience, and people love baseball, so they would invite all these teams in there. So I know I was looking, Double Duty Radcliffe came there with the Claybrook Tigers.
Okay.
And I saw that one night they didn't show. And I was asking Radcliffe, he said, well, they cheated us the night before, so the next night we just didn't come back. So, but when I was talking to him, he said, he said they had a guy named Emery Osborne, which he was like a local pitcher there in Kansas City, Kansas, white guy, and he would cut the ball. And Radcliffe said, I showed him how to cut the ball.
Make it dance a little bit on the way home plate.
In other words, he could cut the ball too.
Yeah.
So he said, I showed him how to cut the ball.
Interesting.
He was cutting the ball. I said, but I can cut it better.
Yeah.
So anyway, but, and then there was a lot of good
I taught him everything he knows. I didn't teach him everything I know.
That's probably right. That's probably better said than the way I phrased it. But all of these histories are just, really outstanding histories.
Yeah.
And then, one other thing I learned in my 200 city tour, I actually tried to model it after what the Negro Leaguers are doing.
Right.
So it was nothing for me to do 2 cities in one day. So I would come into a town and I do a presentation at 10:30, and then I load everything up, and then at 1:30, I may be an hour, 45 minutes away in another town where the Monarchs had played at one time, and I'm giving a presentation there. And then I might, if I hang around, I might do 2 on Sunday. But the thing about Sunday, a couple of things you learn, because I did this so much. Yeah. You never mix it with church, so you always want to do 1:30 or 2. So people come to church, and you have a good presentation. On Saturday, you can do a 10:30 and say maybe a 1:30, 2 at the latest. But during college football, you only do 10:30 on Saturdays. Because 12 o'clock, you'll have a room full of women. Maybe. You're going to have no guys. Because the guys are going to be watching the football game. So I would come into town, and I say, I can only do 10:30. They said, 10:30? He said, trust me on this one. Trust me.
That's something I'm learning. I'm from Chicago. I'm about to move to South Carolina to take over for the museum. And people, I've been back and forth for years now. And on Saturdays, it shuts down.
Yeah.
And people are like, I'm going to need to leave work early on Saturday. I got to be out of there by 2:15. Well, why? Clemson plays at 3.
Right. That's right. I'm telling you. Before I do a book signing, if I'm doing a book signing, say out in this part of the country, say I'm doing it at Columbia. All right. First thing I'm going to do, if it's football season, I'm going to look at the football schedule. If it's basketball season, I'm going to look at the basketball schedule. Now, if they're playing a night game and I can come in there and do a book signing on Saturday, I'm ready for that.
Right.
I don't compete against.
And you can compete with basketball way more than football. Nobody's showing up if there's a football game.
Nobody. It's just really strange. Yeah. But you have to be aware of all those things.
Right.
And those were the things that the Monarchs were aware of. I remember a story. The Monarchs went into Winnipeg, Canada. This might have been like 33, maybe 1933. And Winnipeg was in the Northern League, and they had a really good team. And they were fighting it out for first place. So the Monarchs are coming in, and J.L. Wilkinson said, well, we don't want to mess with your crowd or anything. He said, don't worry. He said, we're in a pennant run. We'll have a good crowd. So anyway, everybody went to see the Monarchs in the House of David. They drew about 10,000 for a couple games, and the local team was in the pennant race. They didn't draw 1,000. But, he was worried. He didn't think that the Monarchs and House of David would mess with his crowd. He didn't know how well those two teams could draw.
Yeah, he didn't realize what he was dealing with.
He didn't.
I had an internship one season, working in Major League Baseball, where I went to 71 baseball games in the summer. I covered the Cubs and the White Sox. And the way those two teams do their schedules mostly is when the Cubs are in town, the Sox are out of town. Then the Cubs leave and the Sox come in. So there's always a home game in Chicago.
Okay.
So as the journalist or as somebody covering the team, you're at work day after day after day. And, when you were with the team, whether you travel or not, 162 games is a lot of games. When you went on your 200-city tour, did that give you an appreciation for what the Monarchs did? Because not to diminish what you did, but you were only speaking. Imagine if you had to play a baseball game every time you went to a city.
Well,
and sometimes 2 in one day.
oh,
and sometimes 3 in one day.
Yeah, I certainly gained a new appreciation for how hard they worked, because the other thing is I drove.
Right.
So I've
got to get there too.
Yeah, I've got to drive there, give the presentation, and then drive back or drive to the next city
and give another presentation. Right.
Yep. And
it's grueling.
And because I kind of patterned myself after that. For instance, I went to Canada. And so I'm going to work my way up like the Kansas City Monarchs used to do. They didn't just leave Kansas City and go to Saskatchewan. They worked their way up. So I'm going to do the same thing, right? And so I started putting everything together. I'm on the telephone and, cutting deals. It's the same thing they did.
Right.
Cutting deals. I mean, I've seen enough letters from Tom Baird to know how you cut these deals, right? So anyway, I'm cutting deals. And so I ended up speaking 12 nights in a row. So what I would do is I would speak, these are afternoons, actually evenings. And so then I would go back and I would sleep. Then the next day I'd get up. Then in the daytime I would travel to the next place. So I get there about midday. I go and, do whatever I need to do. And then 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, I'm speaking, finish speaking. It's kind of like playing a night game.
Right.
I go back and I work my way all the way to Canada. And some days I spoke more than once because I would speak at the Optimus or Kiwanis or something like that. And I did that all the way into Canada.
Wow.
The only way that I could do that was having the knowledge of how they did this with the Negro Leagues. So I really learned a lot about barnstorming.
Yeah.
One thing I would notice, like I went to Denver, and I noticed this. I noticed the Monarchs would play in Salina, and then the next day they're in Denver, right? And no hotel stay. And so I said, why did they do that? So when I'm out there doing the barnstorming, I realized that if you're in a bus, you play a night game. See, sometimes these night games, they might not end until 10, 10:30, 11, something like that.
Yeah.
In these small towns, because sometime in the summer it would be so hot, they wouldn't start the game until 8, sometime 9 o'clock. So they would play the night game, and then they would get on the bus. And then the next day, they're going to travel overnight, sleep on the bus. The next day, they're going to wake up in Denver. No hotel. So Tom Baird or J.L. Wilkinson, if they're running the Monarchs, they don't have to pay for a hotel that night. It's gas you would have spent anyway, just getting there.
Right.
So they would get to Denver, and then once you're in Denver, you would be able to find a place to stay, where you couldn't find a good place in maybe Salina or Hayes or something like that, and so or Great Bend.
And you could spend the day walking around town telling people to come see you play that night too.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, go see old friends, hang out a little bit, maybe even get a good shower.
Yeah.
So it was an art.
Yeah.
And unless you do that traveling, sometimes you don't understand that. So when I came out of doing the Barnstorming, the 200 city tour, finishing that, it was only natural that my next book would be one about barnstorming, because I had learned a lot, and I wanted to share some of that information as is pertinent.
Yeah.
For instance, I walked in today, and today it's like February 14th, 13th, and it's like 7 degrees, right? And something popped in my head, because I had written a story about the founding of the Negro National League, right, in Kansas City. Well, the meeting originally was scheduled for Indianapolis. So I'm walking in today, and I said, I never checked that. I said, why did they move the meeting from Indianapolis to Kansas City? But you never checked the weather. Well, it could have been a snowstorm.
Right.
In Indianapolis a couple of days before, and it never dawned on me till today to go back and check the weather, because I could never figure out why they moved it from Indianapolis at the last minute to Kansas City. So I'm going to go back and it just never, the research never stops, because you're always thinking. I'll tell you another thing that helped me too was when I was doing research on John Donaldson years ago, and I was trying to figure out where they played, and I knew they were traveling by train, so I would go get maps with train tracks from 1915. I've done the same thing with roads. I have road maps at home from the 30s, the 20s. So if I'm trying to figure out where they went, through a certain year, I can look and see where the highways went. And of course, they didn't have the interstate,
Right.
And these highways had really strange names sometimes.
Are you doing anything to digitize all of your archives?
Not yet. I'm trying to figure out what's going to be a good depository for it.
Yeah.
So I'm talking to some people and starting to get some ideas and starting to organize a few things. So I know that probably the first thing I will probably give to the archives, wherever I send it, is all my correspondences I had when I was at the Royals.
Mm-hmm.
They're all on Royals letterhead, so I can kind of pull those out of the record real fast, and a lot of good stuff in there. Because when I was at the Royals, people found out that they could find me real easy. So so they would hear about my work, and so they said, "Hey, he works for the Royals." So they would just write me at the Royals, and I'd write them back on Royals letterhead. But I had tons of letters.
Yeah.
So, but that's something that would be good. And the other thing is, I collected a lot of photographs. So unlike a lot of people today, I actually have negatives.
Yeah. Amazing.
I know. You remember those old things? And if you want a bigger picture, get a bigger negative, right? Okay. So times have changed a little bit, but it's been a fun ride.
So let's bring this back to Major League Baseball since you brought up your time with the Royals. In 1981, 18.7% of the league's players and 22% of the All-Star Game rosters were African American. In 1986, Major League Baseball had its highest percentage ever of African American born players with 19%. So that's nearly 1 out of every 5 players in baseball. 3 years later, in 1989, Major League Baseball launched its RBI program, which stands for Reviving Baseball in Inner Cities, and whose mission statement is basically to provide young people from underserved and diverse communities the opportunity to play baseball and softball. You've spent more than 30 years coaching baseball and have volunteered your time to RBI, which awarded you actually with the Josh Gibson Division Baseball Coach of the Year award. Just to give people a little background, alumni of the RBI program who went on to play in Major League Baseball include CeCe Sabathia, Jimmy Rollins, Coco Crisp, James Loney, Carl Crawford, BJ and Justin Upton. So obviously there are success stories within the program's history. But in 2017, only 6.7% of major leaguers were African American, despite the fact that 20% of first-round draft picks from 2012 to 2017 were African American. So do you think programs like RBI actually work, or is it just Major League Baseball being able to have something that they can hold up to the camera and say, look at everything we're doing and all this money we're spending to promote diversity?
Yeah, they definitely work. I've seen kids develop because they had the opportunity to develop. We would get kids, for instance, we had children on our team, boys on our team, who were cut from high school teams. These were predominantly white schools. And so they didn't have a Jackie Robinson. They might have a Jackie Robinson on the basketball team to be a white guy, but they didn't have any Jackie Robinson on the baseball team. Yeah. And so they were cut guys. And so they were able to come and play in the summertime. And then some of their urban schools' programs were not strong. So the summer ball became where you had really good coaches. It became important. So yeah, it definitely works. There's still a lot of work to be done in that. The other thing that RBI is up against now is that many athletes now, the demand if you're playing basketball, so you're going to have AAU, and so you're playing almost year round.
Right.
So you're far more dedicated, where not like you can move from sport to sport to sport, like, once upon a time could have happened. So you would have, like a Dave Winfield who's playing football, baseball, and basketball. Now it's harder to do that. So they're up against that as well. The other thing that I think they're up against is that, and this is just my own way of looking at it, and sometimes I have some unique ways of looking at things. I'm just tell you they're unique, but they come from somewhere. Yeah. But
years of research.
Yeah, years of research, and then just watching.
Right.
Just watching. Right now, I would say that there are actually more African Americans in sports than ever before.
For sure, but specifically baseball, they're not playing as much as they were. I think it's
That's correct.
75% of NBA is black and like a similar number in the NFL. Why are kids not playing baseball?
Well, let me tell you this. When I was coming along, when I grew up, not only was the NBA not 75% black, most college teams are 70% black.
Right.
So, and then if you want to go football, we can go the same way. You know, we take about Alabama Tide, right? We hear about Alabama, where they didn't get a black player on their team till 1971.
Yeah.
You know, so what has happened now is that we have probably more African American athletes than all time, but these other sports are benefiting from those guys. And I don't think we have more African Americans, but if you only have a certain amount of people, right, even though it's more than probably ever has been, every sport is not going to profit like that. So right now, baseball is not profiting that way, but football and basketball are.
Interesting.
Yeah, and once again, you know, you almost have to specialize, you know, in one or two things, and two things are very hard. You know, one year I was in RBI, I had a 18-man roster. You said, well, hey, you got a lot of players on your team. Well, I had 5 players over 6'5".
Whoa.
They were basketball players. One of them was my son. And so what I said was, okay, I've got more players. And I had a problem at the beginning of the season. But once those AAU tournaments started, I didn't have a problem because when they weren't playing, they could come over and play. But if they had the basketball, then they go over there and I had my other guys. So I had to carry a larger roster. Most coaches aren't willing to do that.
Yeah.
You know, but I did have the tallest team in the league.
And they give out awards for that, right?
No. Let's see, did we win? I can't remember. One year we got pretty close, you know, to winning the whole thing. But had some pretty good ball players. But once again, most of them, if you ask people around town, they would be better known for playing basketball than playing baseball, even though they were pretty good baseball players. And then I had one guy who I would coach sometimes, and I knew I couldn't have him all the time because he played with a traveling team, but he was in town, you know, quite a bit. And I said, hey, look, I'd like to have you come over and play for me. And I got busy, and I didn't get a chance to sign him up and send in his application for the league. So I got busy. So anyway, one day he was off, and I said, why don't you come over and play with me today? So the first time he comes, he hits a line drive home run over the fence. Good ball player.
Sounds like it.
The second time, he hits the inside park home run, man. He got out of the box, man. The bases looked like they were like 10 feet apart when he circles the base. Had speed galore. The other coach stopped the game. He said, where'd you get that guy from? Because I hadn't signed him up, right? You know, I thought I could sneak him in. You can't sneak in a guy like that.
Right.
That guy was Darryl Stuckey, who became the safety for the San Diego Chargers. Played 8 years in the NFL, not baseball.
Yeah.
But that's what he could do on a baseball field.
Right.
But no one, unless you were around, saw him play baseball, would even know that he was that good.
Yeah. Judy Johnson, Oscar Charleston, Ray Dandridge, Monty Irvin, they're all in the Hall of Fame, just like old white ball players like Tris Speaker, Paul Wainer, Joe Medwick. Unfortunately, most of their names are largely forgotten, but we've got guys like Buck O'Neil who are not in the Hall of Fame, and of course he belongs in, but does the fact that he isn't enshrined, does that keep his name alive more so than if he was? Because every few years we're given a reason to remember him and talk about how great he was, how great of an impact he had, and how it's such a shame that he's not in the Hall of Fame. Do you think his legacy lives on so strongly because he's not in the Hall of Fame?
No, I don't think it has anything to do with the Hall of Fame at all. I think it has to do a lot with this Negro Leagues Museum in Kansas City, and then also Buck and his ability to connect to people, his ability to speak, and his longevity. So most people, they don't know a black man who's 90 years old to start with. They don't know a black man, you know, who's 80 years old.
Right.
And then to hear a guy like Buck O'Neil who could just really speak and those kind of things, and it was just so impressive. So I think it was his own legacy that makes him outlive some of those guys who were in the Hall of Fame. But, you know, the thing is, if as a baseball historian, and once again, when I did my tour, the closer I am to Kansas City, the more people who know Buck. Now, if I get out to, say, Zanesville, Ohio, or Wheeling, West Virginia, these are places I actually did a presentation. I don't mention Buck's name because, you know, very few people know them. Actually, I'm out that part. I'm going to start talking about the Homestead Grays in your hometown because this baseball was regionalized. So, yeah, I think it's basically because of Buck himself. And then, of course, the museum keeps him alive as well.
So who do you think is the best Negro League player that most people don't know anything about?
Wow. bunch of them. John Donaldson is one.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, John Donaldson, I was leading up in a movement, and Pete Gordon ended up taking over the movement, but he's only found 500 more strikeouts. When they had the 2006 induction, I presented through them. It was 4 guys. Pete Gordon was one of the 4 guys. Dave Kemp, a guy named Malinsky, that was our team. We put together 4,500.
Right, that's the last number I remember seeing. Yeah.
And they rejected it. They rejected it, and couldn't understand it then, and I don't understand it now. But it was rejected. So he's found 500 more, and that was documented. We had it in a spreadsheet, right, city by city, right? Only thing we didn't have with it, in which something Pete has gone out to do, he's gone out to get articles, but we had the numbers, and we had numbers like nobody else. So John Donaldson would be one. One of my favorite players, Lefty Wilson, out of Palmyra, Michigan, turn a century, outstanding player. I like Harry Buckner. Harry Buckner was the first, basically, good pitcher who was a great hitter. He's one of the great home run hitters. Home Run Johnson. Was another one. Yeah, this guy hit 60 home runs in the dead ball era. If you want to, they don't talk about him enough. One guy, he was like a Deion Sanders of the 1905, 1909, Bill Monroe. Outstanding. I don't talk enough about Bill Monroe. And I could probably go on and on and on, but there's just so much there. And we're learning a lot, but there's still a lot we don't know.
So I know that one of your books is thought of being turned into a movie?
Well, I've already written the movie.
The treatment?
Yeah. I've already written it, and I have the whole script. It's all finished.
Yeah.
I just haven't mentioned which one it is, but they're going to have to turn me down. I'll put it that way. You know, years ago, I had a contract with Columbia Pictures. Thomas Carter, I think I mentioned that.
Yeah,
I mentioned it.
On the Hall of Very Good podcast, I think you mentioned
your
relationship with him.
Yeah, and he was the one that was behind
Coach Carter.
Right. And most people know him from Coach Carter or being one of the basketball players on the White Shadow TV show.
Okay. And
so he was part of that movement. I'll get out to California. I'm looking at the script. And I thought it was a pretty bad script from what I knew. And things were out of order in the script. So, like, they would have somebody dying before someone else died. It was obvious that that person didn't die before them. So I said, why do you have this guy dying before them? So, well, we need to kill him off here, to make, So I said, well, I guess that makes sense from a movie standpoint, but it's not accurate history.
Right.
But a lot of movies aren't accurate history.
Correct.
So I began to understand that.
Yeah.
But then they had little things, and I guess me coming from the Midwest, I started to change. I remember there was one little scene they had in there, and Satchel Paige was going into like a drugstore, and he was going to meet Lahoma, for the first time. So he goes in to buy a condom. It's what they had in the script. And I'm an old country boy from Kansas, the Midwest. We're kind of conservative out here. I said, and plus I'm a baseball historian. I said, why don't you have him go in the store and buy something for his arm? I said, ball players used to use like wintergreen and alcohol.
Yeah.
They said, that's a good idea. That's how bad the script was,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I had to give them ideas, but in the end it didn't pan out, and so we didn't get a chance to make it happen. However, I learned an awful lot from that experience, and we're going to see if I learned enough.
Cool. So other than your potential movie, is there anything on the horizon that you're excited about coming up for you?
Yeah, my next book is going to be a oral history of people I've interviewed.
Very cool.
Over the last 40 years.
When you do interviews, do you record them, or is it just handwritten notes, or do you have audio and video?
I had a combination of both.
Yeah.
I have lots of audio.
That would make a really cool supplement to the book, to have like an audio.
That's exactly
archive.
Right.
Yeah.
So you can actually hear their voices. A lot of new technology out there now. You don't even have to use a CD.
Right.
So I'm pulling out my old tapes, and I'm looking forward to actually completing this book. So, but there are interviews of voices. How often do you get to hear Chet Brewer?
Right.
Telling his story. But in that particular case, Chet Brewer, I have him, and talking to him. I remember, one thing I remember, I was going back and listening to some of these tapes.
Mm-hmm.
I have a lot of wives, too. So you're going to hear some women who didn't play baseball, but they could sure tell some stories about their husbands.
And have a very interesting perspective, I would imagine.
Very, very.
Yeah.
And so I'm just kind of excited about that. But like I said, if you can hear Chet Brewer tell his story.
Yeah.
And the funny thing I remember when I was interviewing Chet Brewer, we talked for about 20 minutes, and he knew I was going to do an interview. And so he said, well, I'm ready to start the interview. So I've been recording for 20 minutes, man. He said, oh, you've been recording?
What do you think we're here for?
We've been talking. He thought we were just talking baseball.
Yeah.
I was recording, but we were talking baseball.
Yeah.
But it was just like a conversation.
Those are the best interviews.
Yeah, just like a conversation. He didn't even know he was being interviewed.
Yeah.
So we hope that maybe it'll come across like that. But just listening to the tapes, oh, man, great memories for me to go back and hear some of these people talking about their lives.
I bet.
And family members and things like that, yeah.
How can people follow you on social media if they want to keep up with your work and see what's coming up next for you?
Oh, definitely on Twitter, at Negro League Man on Twitter, and Facebook. I put most of my appearances on a Negro League baseball author, Phil S. Dixon.
Yeah.
I'll be there. And I'm putting together a new website, NLB Alive, Negro League Baseball Alive. And it's about me and how you can keep up with me, from there.
Cool.
You know, my wife doesn't like me putting everything on Facebook. She said, you put on Facebook, people know you're not here. Okay, so I want to make sure that the people who are following baseball know where I am. So I'm doing this page, and I'm pretty excited. So it's Negro League Baseball, NLB Alive. And that's what I've been trying to do all these years, to keep Negro League Baseball alive.
And you're doing a great job of it.
Yeah, I'm going to keep on working at it, too.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your time today. I really
Thank you.
appreciate sitting down with you. This was incredible for me.
And it's been my pleasure, and hope you enjoy Kansas City while you're here.
Thank you very much.
All right.
All right. Now it's time for a segment called What'd You Think, Mom?, where we talk to my mom who just listened to the interview with me, and we ask her what she thinks. This is my real, actual mom. Her name is Lori, but I've always just called her Mom. Can you say something to prove that you are my actual mom?
I just had a flashback to Dave Letterman with his mom episodes, so I'm honored.
All right, that'll do.
Well, if someone knows me, they know Dave Letterman is all I need to say. So.
All right, so what did you think of the Phil S. Dixon interview?
It was so interesting on so many levels. Again, from the historian standpoint, listening to him talk about how he went about his research, just clever ideas of how he went about his research, but then also learning about some of the players and not really thinking that I lived concurrently with some of them.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, Phil was talking about meeting Kevin Harlan, and that Kevin Harlan's first gig was broadcasting Satchel Paige's funeral in 1982. And when I thought of Satchel Paige, I would always think of him as being a classic old-timer, kind of like Babe Ruth, gone before I would have any living recollection, and that wasn't the case.
Right.
So that was one thing. The minute Phil started talking, he had me at Buck O'Neill. I have always been fascinated and emotionally attracted to Buck O'Neill from the first time seeing him in Ken Burns' baseball series, because that was aired for the first time in 1994. It was about 6 years after my grandfather died, and there was just something about watching Buck O'Neill on screen that brought Jaja to me. They physically looked the same, and his face was so open, and he spoke from the heart, and he had such passion. But he wasn't an angry man. He was just, he wanted to share this wealth of information he had. And thank God someone tapped into that knowledge, and we have it on tape. If you had me name players from the Negro Leagues, he would be number one, and he would take up 1 through 10 for me because he was so important. Satchel Paige, of course, would be the next name, and there would be other names I could name you too before even listening to Phil. But to me, Buck O'Neill made the Negro Leagues something that all Americans should have been aware of, and Ken Burns was the vehicle that brought Buck O'Neill to the American consciousness. I have museum envy for you on this one because I want to be at the Negro League Museum badly. I hope to still get out there. So, talking about some of the things that Phil talked about in his research and just how when you still have access to original sources and how as a young guy working for the Kansas City Royals, and he can go up to Frank Robinson in the locker room and say, hey, can you tell me about how cool is that? And don't you wish you had access to a Shoeless Joe Jackson or to any of his contemporaries? But then the other side of it is Phil is the historian, he is the researcher, he is the teller of the truths. But then because of his network and the contacts that he makes, he's actually the guy who does the epitaph on the back of Satchel Paige's tombstone, which is amazing. It's, when you see the photograph of it, describing how Satchel Paige got his nickname, but then also his philosophy in life with 6 different little rules to live by according to Satchel Paige, and they speak to Satchel Paige's personality, and I really like that a lot. But the opportunity to be part of history, not just be the capturer of it. Now, Phil is part of the history.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, he's written so many books and is always working on that kind of stuff. People like him are important to document because a lot of people think like, oh yeah, everybody knows this story because it's, it's going on right now. So of course, but in 10 years or 20 years or 100 years, those people aren't going to be around anymore. And there needs to be some record to let people access those stories and that information in the future. And people like Phil are so important in that regard.
Absolutely. What he talks about, his methodology, you can translate to taking your own family history or any type of history that you want to do, because it takes a name on a piece of paper and makes it into a 3-dimensional human being. The idea of contacting or seeking out the women who were the wives or the girlfriends and using them as resources because, God bless us, we have longevity on you guys.
And it rounds out the person
Absolutely
as a character, not just a baseball player. It tells you who they were. Those stories are interesting and important too.
Right. It takes it off the field. And for example, what he put on the back of Satchel Paige's monument, he could have put stats. We know the stats. What he put was, these are the rules he lived by. This was what he thought in his head of how...
This is who he was as a person.
Right. And that just changes everything. I like the idea of going to the girlfriends and some of the stories he's, I particularly like the story about the one lady who gets mad and just shoots the guy in the middle of the street. Don't be scared. It
was a different time back then.
Sure. Yeah. Let's go with that. And the other thing about pulling out maps, for people who have maybe forgotten that a map can be something you hold in your hand, and looking, studying the railroad lines and studying the old highways before the interstate. That's just a great exercise to do and get on those roads, those back ways, and get a slice of Americana while it's still out there, because that's being gobbled up, But if anything's going to give you the flavor of what they had to go through as they were traveling from town to town, that would be it.
We watched a movie a couple weeks ago called The Green Book, the story about Don Shirley. And I think that is an aspect of the travel that most people don't really necessarily think about when you're thinking about a minor league baseball team today is they're traveling on a bus too, but they're not quite living the same life or going through the same experiences that these Negro League players who were also traveling on a bus from city to city that they went through and had to go through, unfortunately. But those stories and those experiences are definitely part of what makes the Negro Leagues such an enduring tale, I think.
I agree. Today we can watch movies like the Jackie Robinson story, or we can see documentaries, or we can watch A League of Their Own, and there's the hint of the Negro League question mark with the woman who throws back the ball that went afoul. But that's just a little glimpse, and it's not the reality. And to think that the people who lived through that, the men, the players who lived through that as Negro League players, and how they kept pushing the bar just by virtue of what they were doing, kept pushing the bar in the civil rights fight. And Phil addressed it himself. When you asked it early on in the interview, how much of the museum is civil rights documentation coinciding with and juxtaposed to what was going on in the Negro Leagues. And his answer is you can't have one without the other.
Mm-hmm.
Again, as students of history, and especially that aspect of history, which is so important to who we are today, it makes that museum that much more of a jewel to go and explore and really get the feel for who they were, what they did, and what they accomplished.
Yeah, I think a couple other things that were interesting that Phil talked about were how people who claim that statistics from a career are accurate are out of their mind. You can't
Exactly.
You can't possibly do it.
Right.
Phil mentions that in his books or his research, he will feel comfortable saying a person hit 375 during this series because, well, I have every box score from that series, so I can do the math and I know. But I can't tell you in 1941 who hit,
Right.
or what their career was because we don't have all the information. So even that aspect of the research is you're never going to have a complete picture of who these guys were as players because the information either was never available or isn't currently available. And so that's, I think, one of the reasons why he focuses more on who they were as people and, what type of player they were, but not exactly trying to narrow down like their career numbers.
It's a double tragedy. It's like getting screwed again
Mm-hmm.
because they had to work twice as hard to get the accolades back in real time. And now, because things weren't documented the way it was in the major leagues, their history is again lost
Mm-hmm.
and won't be traceable.
And it allows for their detractors to say, when people say Josh Gibson had over 800 home runs,
Mm-hmm.
somebody who doesn't really believe in the Negro League players will say, how can you prove that?
Right.
Well,
Right.
what we can't prove is that it wasn't 1,400 home runs. Those statistics are a double-edged sword, I think, because it grows the legend for a lot of these guys with these insane numbers. And we, towards the end of the interview, he talked about John Donaldson, the pitcher, with all these strikeouts and guys like Satchel Paige, who pitched for 50 years, and Josh Gibson had all his home runs, and all these insane numbers that happened, and they could have been even greater. I'm sure they were because we don't have every single game or inning or appearance documented. So yeah, I think it's just interesting the way that the statistics bear out who gets remembered.
The John Donaldson story highlights that they're still fighting the same battle because he does as much research as he can. He has a team assembling the stats, and they go and do whatever they can, and they're able to document a certain number, which is a ridiculous number, and the committee won't even look at that. Totally invalidating his effort. So what is that? But I want to go back to what you just said. Satchel Paige pitching for 50 years.
Right.
You
Crazy.
take if a pitcher makes it into his 50s as a pitcher, and this guy did it for 50 years, it's mind-boggling.
Yeah. Phil also talked about town ball a little bit, and I thought that was kind of an interesting concept and a parallel to Shoeless Joe a little bit with Textile League baseball. They're very similar. Town ball is a little bit more organized than just random pickup games, but not quite as organized as a minor league. So when Phil said that town ball kind of went away at a certain point, it is true because, the minor leagues took over, and it's, baseball isn't as popular or prevalent today that it was, 70 years ago. But I think the parallels there between the textile leagues and town ball all over America were pretty interesting to me.
Right. That was very interesting, and it shows the popularity of the game, and, especially in the smaller towns.
I think town ball was a way that made baseball so popular because every town or most towns had a team where little kids and families could go watch these games play, and then they become interested in baseball, and it's so on and so on. And the current fight that Major League Baseball is having to maybe contract the minor leagues and get rid of 40 teams or however many teams they want to get rid of, I just don't understand how they're looking at this because they think it's going to protect their bottom line, but in the long run, it's going to kill the sport because you don't have a fan base in North Dakota.
Right.
And you don't have a fan base in Peoria, Illinois. And, these towns need baseball if you want them to be interested in your product.
If you're already worried about you're losing the younger generation, what does town ball do? The concept of town ball. You have the minor leagues, and the kids can two kids
For
can get
$6.
a ball and a bat,
Right.
and they can start getting hooked.
Mm-hmm.
It takes two kids. You don't need, more than that. And I agree. Major League Baseball is walking away from that, and that's how you get them hooked.
It's the old phrase, penny smart, dollar foolish.
Right.
Tripping over dollars to pick up dimes.
Right.
There's a lot of different ways to say that concept.
We have such a thriving minor league team here in Greenville with the Greenville Drive, and the owner who does all these, gets the concept of bring people into the park and have it be a family-oriented thing. And it doesn't cost an arm and a leg. It is truly a family-building event, and they just get it. And so I would think a lot of minor league teams around the country that are now going to be shut down, I think a lot of them would have gotten it too, and I just don't see it.
Yeah.
The thing about when Phil was talking about town ball, he was saying how when he would be speaking to original players, and the players would tell him that when they were starting out, an older player would say, when you get to this town, go ask about so-and-so, because they'll be able to put an arm around you and take you under their wing. And that is what it became, a network of comfort and security based on your hometown. And, that player's from that town too, so it just worked out so well. And I don't think you really even have that now because professional players, even in the minor leagues, are so managed. That connection is lost. But for Phil, again, as a historian, he could follow those hometown ties and how he talked about going to a phone booth and pull out the phone book page. Somebody might have to Google that to see exactly what that's about.
Right.
But what a smart reference. What a great way to use that as a resource, or go to AME churches.
Well, that was kind of the same thing that I did when one of my dirt collecting road trips in Bastrop, Louisiana. I couldn't find record of where the field was, the original field that Joe played on. And I was there on a Sunday, so the Historical Society was closed. The library was closed, everything that
Right.
I would have been able to use to access information. So I was like, all right, well, I just drove, 7 hours to get here. I'm going to talk to somebody. So I went into like a hardware store and tried to find an old man. And there weren't really any. And so I was like, okay, well, this is my train of thought. Where should I go next? And one of the guys who worked there goes, 3 miles away, there's a retirement home. Bingo.
Right.
So I went over there, and it made me sound crazy to walk in and say, hey,
Security.
who is the oldest person here?
Right. Who is still sane.
Right. And they're like, and why do you need this? You're trying to get a jar of dirt? So I ended up talking to the woman who used to be the wife of the mayor of Bastrop, and she knew exactly where the field was. And so I had it narrowed down to 2 or 3 possible locations before I got there. And so I could see the wheel starting to turn when I asked her, and she just couldn't get it. And I wanted to let her say it without influence.
Prompting, right.
But when I could tell that she wasn't quite able to come up with it, I gave her the 3 things that I thought it could be. And she's like, oh yeah, it was definitely this one.
Perfect.
Yeah, same thing, same concept. You just talk to people who possibly knew and hope that you get your answer.
Right. And what you said, that's exactly what he said. He would go to the AME church and ask the minister, who's the oldest person with the sharpest mind. When he talked about he would go to the barber because the barber knew everyone's business. And when he said he went to the barber named Floyd, he just about had me because, really.
All right. Any closing thoughts on the Phil S. Dixon interview?
Yeah, I think I need to be going to Amazon and checking out some of those books because he had me hooked.
Yeah, definitely. When he came out with Negro Baseball Leagues, A Photographic History, that is just an incredible book. And to think that book came out almost 30 years ago now, at the time it was the first thing of its kind. There were no collection of photographs of Negro League baseball or black baseball existed at that point. So he was really a groundbreaking historian and author. And now you can just go on Google and image search a lot of these things. He was the guy who really started it all, as far as I'm concerned. It was really a pleasure and an honor to be able to talk to him because he is an interesting and important person in the documentation of Negro League history.
A veritable encyclopedia of information just walking around. It was excellent.
Okay, so that's it. In the introduction of this episode, I mentioned a trivia question that you can answer to win something, and here's how you can do that. First, make sure you're following us on Twitter at Shoeless Podcast. Then, find the pinned tweet at the top of our profile with the link to the Phil S. Dixon episode, which asks this week's trivia question. The answer to the trivia question was somewhere in this episode that you just finished listening to. So retweet that tweet along with your answer, and we'll announce the winner in next week's episode. You don't have to be first, you just have to be right. And you've got to be following us. We'll pick one person who answered correctly, and they'll get a paperback copy of Phil's book, John Buck O'Neill, The Rookie, The Man, The Legacy, 1938. If you have questions about the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum, about the podcast, or about anything else, you can email me at shoelesspodcast@gmail.com, and I'll try to answer them in next week's episode. If you want to send in a video or audio recording, that's cool too. One of our listeners, Van Edwin Hooser, who is on Twitter at Centerfield24, did just that this past week. He asked, "What is the story behind Joe's decision to get a job instead of go off to war? I know some people's opinion is that he was a draft dodger, and I know it had to do with his change of classification and having a family, but I would like a clearer explanation." So I got in touch with our team of Shoeless Joe experts, Mike Miller, Mike Nola, and Jacob Pomrenke, and asked them what the story was. I also referenced a few articles online, which I'll link in the liner notes of this episode. So anyway, here's what I found out. In May 1918, Provost Marshal General Enoch Crowder issued the famous Work or Fight order, stating that every healthy American male between the ages of 21 and 30 must find essential work by July 1st or face military conscription. By the spring of 1918, 3 of Joe Jackson's brothers had already volunteered for military service. Joe was the sole supporter of his wife Katie, his mother, a younger brother, and a sister. Because of this, the Greenville, South Carolina Draft Board had placed him in Class 4, making him safe from the draft. However, his draft status changed from Class 4 to Class 1A, which meant that he was available for immediate and unrestricted military service. The first sign that his draft status changed happened around May 2nd in 1918. Even then, most people thought Joe would be able to finish the baseball season before being drafted. But by May 10th, that had all changed, and this was reported. A telegram received tonight from his exemption board in Greenville, South Carolina. Joe Jackson of the White Sox will go before a local examining board tomorrow to certify if he is physically qualified for the Army draft. The White Sox were in Philadelphia for a series against the A's when Joe received the dispatch informing him of his reclassification. He reported as ordered to the Philadelphia examining board and passed with a perfect mark. Thanks to his low draft number of 846, Joe was told to expect orders to leave for an Army training camp within the next 2 weeks, a situation that he initially seemed to accept. "Well, the old boy will be out there slugging the Dutchman pretty soon," Jackson said, "and if I ever draw a bead on one of them birds, it'll be all off with him." When the White Sox departed for Cleveland the next day, Jackson was nowhere to be found. He soon turned up, though, and at the urging of his wife, Jackson announced that he had accepted a position to work as a painter at the Harlan Yard in Wilmington, Delaware, which was a subsidiary of Bethlehem Steel. Shipyard workers, like those in other vital war industries, were usually exempt from military service. According to some sources, White Sox owner Charles Comiskey had initially encouraged his players to try to find exemptions to remain playing for the White Sox as long as possible. But as the winds of public opinion began to shift, so too did Comiskey's stance. "There's no room on my club for players who wish to evade the Army draft by entering the employ of shipbuilders," he told reporters. And Comiskey was so upset he threatened to not take the jumpers, as they were called, back on the White Sox after the war. It soon became apparent that what really upset Comiskey was not that Joe was being unpatriotic, but that he was playing baseball for someone else. And this was a theme among many baseball owners, though, not just Comiskey. They were outraged that fans were going to see their baseball stars play for someone else, especially if it meant their big league clubs were falling in the standings without them. An article in the Times on December 9th, 1918 stated, "Joe Jackson may be banished to St. Louis because he got himself a trench-proof job after having been placed in Class 1A. If Joe Jackson is barred from professional baseball on account of his shipbuilding job, there will be several others who will also feel the heavy hand of baseball's displeasure, for Joe is not alone in his hurdling act. There is a measure of right in Joe's action, for he had a family to support and was shifted from Class 4A to Class 1A without notice, on what appears to have been a case of hometown spite. Shoeless was not afraid to fight. He'll battle at the drop of a hat. But he felt like he wasn't given the proper kind of deal, so he obtained essential employment and continued to care for the dependents at home. The settlement of the Jackson case is awaited with considerable interest on Joe's account, as well as on the account of those others who did likewise, but under different circumstances." Another article, titled "Retreats to Shipyard," stated, The fighting blood of the Jackson is not as red as it used to be in the days of Old Stonewall and Old Hickory, for General Joe of the White Sox has fled to the refuge of a shipyard. A writer in the Sporting News was one of the only journalists to offer some defense for Joe, stating that there was something unfair in the Greenville Draft Board decision. I can't understand why Joe was placed in Class 1A. There are many stars of the big leagues who are married and have many times the amount of wealth Joe possesses who are in Class 4. It appeared the Greenville decision was made to give a great show of not offering favoritism to a famous athlete. It's also possible it was the result of a personal grudge. While the newspapers made it appear that everyone was against Joe's decision, many people defended him. Former Chicago teammate Alfred Fritz von Kaulnitz, a major in the wartime army, insisted that Joe had every right to hold a shipyard job. During the draft period, I will venture there were thousands of men walking the streets in civilian clothes with exemption papers in their pockets with far less claims than Joe, he said. And it's not like Joe was a slacker, as some portrayed him to be. He actually worked 12-hour days painting ships. Several executives at the shipyard wrote letters saying how hard Joe worked and how respected he was among the men he worked with. And in fact, the shipyard not only accepted Jackson, it promoted him to painting inspector despite him being illiterate. If Jackson should stay at the shipyard as an employee, he would be eligible to play in the Bethlehem Steel Baseball League as a member of the Wilmington team, a wire service reported. The Delaware River and Steel Leagues both played their games on Saturdays, and Harlan had a team in each. Jackson suited up for Harlan's Steel League team and appeared in his first game on June 1st. The uproar over Joe soon faded from the public's attention as much more pressing matters arose and attention turned to, the actual fighting that was going on in Europe. As for the 1918 shipyard season, it turned out pretty well for Joe. He was the star of the Steel League, hitting .393. On September 14th, before 4,500 fans, Shoeless Joe was a whole show in himself. He doubled and he homered twice off of former Cardinal and Dodger pitcher Dan Greiner. When Jackson hit his second home run, which virtually clinched the game and series for Harlan, the Wilmington fans went money mad and showered him with greenbacks, the New York Sun wrote. For more than 5 minutes, he was kept busy walking to the boxes and pulling in bills. After he had his fist full, he walked over to the box directly behind home plate and handed them to his wife. The Harlan and Hollingsworth team won 4-0 that day, winning the Atlantic Coast Shipyard Championship thanks to the offensive heroics of Joe Jackson and a 2-hit shutout from their star pitcher, Lefty Williams. The First World War ended less than 2 months later with the armistice on November 11th. Shoeless Joe and Lefty Williams both returned to Chicago and played the 1919 season for Charles Comiskey's White Sox. The rest, as they say, is history. If you guys have questions you'd like answered in next week's episode, reach out on social media or via email, and we'll do our best to answer an interesting one. A lot of you have rated and reviewed my baseball history in the past couple weeks, and we're so thankful for that. It's a huge help when you rate and review the show on whatever platform you choose to listen to. 5-star ratings help our podcast get shown on more people's suggested podcast pages, which means that more people are going to hear our show. It just takes a couple of seconds of your time, but it really does help us a lot. Our numbers have grown every single week, which has been really exciting to watch. And of course, liking us on social media, interacting with our posts, and sharing things with your friends is great too. No matter how you choose to support us, even if it's just by listening, we appreciate you being here. Until next time, I'm Dan Wallach, and this is My Baseball History.